Hi everyone, it's Dr. Antonelli again. We are still in Educational Psychology's topic 10 on assessment, but this is actually part 3 of the PowerPoint. So if you take a look and find the slide that says types of assessment and ways to measure student learning, this is where we're going to start for part 3. There are two kinds of assessments that we're going to discuss here in reference to tests, the difference being written versus performance tests. And then there's two slides after this which give a little bit more few more details about the difference. Written tests being really short answer, very select kind of responses that are required, and performance tests have a little bit more open-endedness to them. There's a variety of things that students can do, creating portfolios, demonstrations, exhibitions, all of these things that really require them to kind of use their knowledge and skills over a period of time to complete a project or a task. It's more long-term. It's usually set under more or less realistic conditions. A lot of times teachers are reluctant to use these performance tests because there's a current emphasis on standardized testing and how well students do on those. So it's often a little bit more difficult to establish reliability and validity, which we talked about in the part 2 of the PowerPoint. Okay, so when we look at written tests, they obviously things are objective. They're assessing almost just foundational information that students know, terms, definitions, steps of doing something. They're very often short answer or essays, but it's focused in on certain specific ideas or foundations of information. The advantages is that they're pretty easy to create the questions, yet we can have a wide range of questions, but all about the same content. They're very efficient, obviously, to give and grade. And the disadvantages are that, a lot of the focus is on just like memorization of information, spitting it back. And then sometimes with essays, the disadvantage is that different teachers grade essays in very different ways, okay? So that's all about written tests. When we talk about performance tests, we talked about these things that students will do. Direct writing, write about a specific topic. Portfolio is kind of this folder that has a progression of work, let's say over a period of time or different stages that they completed something. A display of something is an exhibition of their whatever they were working on, and then demonstration is showing students showing how they can actually do something or perform a task based on information they learned that they then applied. Okay, how can we measure student learning? Well, when we use written tests, we can do norm referenced grading, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, or we can do criterion referenced grading. Norm referenced is where we compare the scores of students to each other. Criterion referenced is where we have a set of criteria that says your paper did this, your paper made a connection, your paper had 3 written support answers, your paper had an opening, your paper had a closing, and we base it on certain criteria. When we grade written tests and how we measure if students have learned. With performance tests, we often mainly use the criterion reference piece because when students are asked to do something or to have an exhibition or to have a portfolio or to do a demonstration, they're using a lot more kind of activity and more realistic things that they're actually doing. So we have to allow for that. It can't just be a strict set of right or wrong answers. So we need to have and use some scoring kind of rubrics. Okay, so that's really important. This is an example, these next 3 slides, of if you were to assign a group oral presentation and you would pick 3 levels: excellent, good, and minimal. And for each of those levels, you would take a look at different areas. So what would the content of an excellent oral presentation be? It could be that the students gave really correct and specific research-based information. They added, unique audio-visual components. That's something else to look at. Looking at the group members themselves, did every single member of the group participate in the presentation and was informed? And did they maintain eye contact, the audience, with the presenters, and did they ask many questions? So you might actually, use that as a piece as well of an excellent. If this was good, these same 4 areas were looked at. Notice the words just change a bit. So instead of under content being accurate, specific, and research-based, here in a good evaluation, the content was less detailed and it was lacking in depth and it was limited in the number of resources that they actually used, okay? And then the audiovisual components, it didn't really, it supported the topic, but it didn't do more than that in how it was presented using audiovisual components. The group members criteria piece was, well, okay, most of them were active and most were informed, but not all, because all was when we were looking back at the excellent, okay? And then for audience members, well, some of the members of the audience were not actually participating, and some of the questions asked really didn't go with what the presentation was about. So again, that's the good level. Then we get to the minimal level, and again, we use the same four components. And notice the wording again is different. So for content, it's limited information. It doesn't necessarily stay on topic. It wasn't presented in their own words. That piece, very different than the good and very different than the excellent content, if you notice. It just kind of goes down to minimal. It traditionally goes downward. And then audio-visual components, well, whatever they did was not necessarily appropriate. It wasn't really original. Whatever they had in their, visual presentation kind of took away from what they were trying to get across, so it became very confusing. And then for the group itself, not every person participated. One or two members kind of stood out and dominated, and the other ones maybe of the group did not seem prepared at all. And then for the audience, there really wasn't much participation. No questions were asked. There wasn't an activity level in the audience as a result of the presentation. So this is a great example of a scoring rubric to use. Little bit more detail on what I mentioned a couple of slides ago. The criterion reference score is where it's a score that specifically indicates what a student knows or can do. Usually we assign a letter grade based on, how many items were answered correctly. So for example, in a multiple choice test, if there's 10 questions and a student gets 2 wrong, then they get an 80% or a grade of a B traditionally, and that is what is assigned. So it's based on the criteria. A norm reference score is an assessment score that will tell us how well a student does as compared to another student who completed that same assessment, okay? Now, whether the assessment was a standardized test or some other task that was asked, you can still use norm reference scoring. Now, think of your classroom. It's very diverse. It is a heterogeneous group. The assumption is that every classroom is heterogeneous in their diversity and their group. So it's going to naturally have this variation of students who have the ability to, get all of the answers right, some of the answers right. There will be others that get a few of the answers right, and there will be others that maybe get not many answers right. This is where we go through the normal grading on the curve distribution, and it looks like this. You've heard of this. It's called the bell curve, and it assumes that in any class there will be this natural variation of student abilities, 0 being the middle, the highest point, where we will have the majority of students falling above or below that average. And then as you go further up on the right, as the slide comes down here, these are those that go further into the grades of B and A. And then these are those that go further down the scale of D's and F's. But the assumption on the bell curve is that most of the grades will fall in this kind of average BC range. Okay, so just something to think about there. When you're thinking about norm referenced versus criterion referenced, give some thought to what are the strengths and weaknesses of both of those. That would be a good discussion to have with another classmate on that, because there are strengths and weaknesses of both, okay? All right, so when we talk about criterion referenced grading and the idea of mastery, mastery is where a student can actually master certain levels of information before moving on, and then the teacher makes sure that this occurs for every student. How does this apply? How are they related? Students are then given lots of opportunities to master something. So if they are given an assessment that they may not necessarily show they've mastered something, we try to give a different assessment, or we would need to reteach and then give a different assessment to show that they've mastered it. We may have to create new criteria to make sure that they've mastered it. So this kind of approach assumes that every student in the class can achieve if they're given kind of a good quality instruction, if they're given a lot of time or a sufficient time to learn it, and of course if they're motivated to learn. Okay, so how can teachers use this approach when grading? Well, you need to go back through your unit, pick out things that are most important, list them in some sort of outline, give students that outline, make up a study guide related to the outline, and then use a variety of methods to kind of, go through those things on the outline. Then, of course, continuing this idea by making up exam questions that are based on the outline or the study guide that you've given students. Arrange these questions that you've created for the exam into at least kind of 2, maybe 3 other exams for each unit, so that if a student does not show you mastery on the first time taking it, you can give them, Form B. This is that Form A, Form B of the exam, okay, which would still be reliable because you're asking the same questions and to show mastery of the same material, okay? Of course, then make up some tentative criteria for what grade levels for each exam that should show if they've mastered this, they're at this grade level. If they've mastered this, they're at this grade level. And then, of course, when you're testing students, the best way is when they're ready, basically. So when they come to you and say, I'm ready to take the test, or when you feel they've had enough or ample or sufficient opportunity to actually learn the material, then give the test. Continuing with that, grade and return those exams as quickly as possible so you can go over things, offer to go over exams individually with students, schedule the alternate exams if they haven't reached mastery or showed their mastery of the material based on their score on the exam, and of course be available for questions and any sort of tutoring they might need. If the student takes a second exam and improves, but they still kind of fall below what is considered mastery, then try to have what we call a safety valve option. Is there something else that they can do to possibly show you that they've mastered the material? Okay, and then in addition to using exams, use other things like oral reports, papers, some other kind of work that students may be able to display their mastery. Think of Akeem in the case study we said in the beginning. He was showing his mastery of some of the reading and writing skills and math skills just in different ways, such as building with Legos instead of the exams that he could not seem to do well on. Okay, so here is what to do related to grades and assessment. This is the yes, what I should do as a teacher. Look at your final grades, base them largely on achievement and hard data, things students have done and accomplished. Use many assessments to determine final grades, not just one, okay? Always share what criteria you're going to use with students and keep them apprised of their progress, how well they're doing. Of course, always involve parents, keeping them in the loop for progress. And of course, with the grade that they receive on an assignment, assessment, or a project or a test, a description of what that actually reflects. Is it just clearly based on a right or wrong answer? Were there additional kinds of things that you utilize, the criteria? Kind of explain why this grade is as it is, okay? And then, of course, if you're trying to assess some more complex things or showing improvement over time, you want to use portfolio and not, let's say, a straightforward written objective assessment of, let's say, multiple choice, okay? These are all good things to do related to grades and assessment. What not to do, what to avoid, okay? This is the oops, please avoid this, okay? Kind of don't be so rigid in how you use an average, meaning like a 75.8 or 75.9 is a C plus. It's so close to a B. I mean, it just, there's so many other things to factor into that, okay? Don't use zeros to kind of reflect if the student just did not do an assignment and they receive a 0. Well, did they really receive that 0 because they don't know the material or they just didn't do the work, okay? Not giving enough time before testing, that's an oops, don't do that. Teaching one thing but testing another, not a good thing to do. Students don't know what they're studying then, okay? Never use a pop quiz. That does not motivate, that has the reverse effect on students. Always share your criteria and what's going to be on the test. Don't keep that a secret. Don't change your criteria after students have submitted and said, oh, now I'm going to weigh spelling at 50% instead of 10%. That changes things. And then don't combine apples and oranges, content and effort, what the content is versus the effort.